Hello, I'm Dan Schillinger, and this is the Week 2 lecture in Historical and Political Thought for Yale-directed studies. I ended last week's lecture by declaring Machiavelli a thoroughly modern political thinker. But now that you've read Thomas Hobbes, perhaps I should modify that assessment. Although Machiavelli broke from classical and medieval political thought by recasting both truth and virtue as the exercise of efficacious power, a fundamental and distinctively modern shift, he nevertheless remained a proponent in many respects of ancient political practice, of direct rule by prudent elites and an armed citizenry for the sake of empire and glory. In the past, in fact, H&P has situated Machiavelli as the last thinker of the fall term, and when I published an article on Machiavelli in the journal History of Political Thought, which has two editors, one for ancient and one for modern political thought, I dealt with the ancients editor. So let's leave open the possibility that Machiavelli is a bridge figure between ancient and modern political thought. Now consider Hobbes. He writes not about princes, but about the impersonal modern state, thus drawing a distinction between state and society. The authority of that state is vested in an abstract office, a sovereign, and it derives through the mechanism of representation from the wills of the governed. Hobbes trumpets not prudence, but method and science. He excoriates vainglorious conquerors and holds up peace as the just purpose of the state and of all individuals within it. He identifies the natural right or liberty of every human being for self-preservation. This natural right stands prior to all political obligations, legitimating and circumscribing them. Hobbes is a materialist, an egalitarian, a skeptic, perhaps even an atheist and a hedonist, and certainly a vociferous critic of classical philosophy and medieval theology. His modernity is unquestionable. Hobbes is not only modern, but timely. Reading Hobbes in this moment feels urgent and disquieting. When Hobbes writes in chapter 13 of Leviathan, page 76 of our Hackett edition, that in the state of nature, quote, there is no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear. Well, did you think of our current anxious condition in which we're unable to travel, to socialize at all, to study or work in person, never mind going to concerts or museums? Worse, we may be unable to shake the fear that a cough is more than a cough, that we or our loved ones may fall ill, even die. In this connection, look at the famous frontispiece of Leviathan. The version in our book just prior to the dedicatory letter isn't as clear as it could be, so I've included a high resolution image with the lecture in the module. Wielding sword and scepter, symbols of state and church respectively, there is the Leviathan rising up over society, yet comprised of its members, seemingly unlimited in its power. The town below is peaceful, eerily so. As one scholar recently pointed out, to the left of the church pictured in the town, you'll see two beaked, masked figures. These are Elizabethan plague doctors, whose beaked masks would have been filled with herbs soaked in vinegar to cleanse the air. In fact, when Hobbes was at Oxford in 1606, his final examinations were canceled due to plague. Sound familiar? There are other resonances too. Since the pictured town is peaceful but empty, we may wonder whether the peace secured by the Leviathan comes at a heavy cost. Perhaps we should think of Hobbes today when we see fences at the southern border or around the US Capitol. Here's yet another echo of Hobbes. Hasn't the US constitutional system ceded almost all power in recent years to executives and judges as opposed to citizens and legislators? Has our sovereign become Hobbesian if it wasn't always more unlimited than we might have liked to think? To that extent, the inclusion of the people within the Leviathan in the frontispiece may disturb us if we are in fact legitimating a powerful state that is not responsive to us. Then we may wonder whether then we may wonder about other forms of citizenship or political community that we may have lost. Let me also place Hobbes in his own historical context, or let me allow Hobbes to do it himself, since he wrote his own verse autobiography, which you can find near the beginning of our volume. Quote, 1588 old style, when that armada did invade our isle, called the Invincible, whose freight was then nothing but murdering steel and murdering men, most of which navy was dispersed or lost, and had the fate to perish on our coast, April the 5th, though now with age outworn, in the early spring, I, a poor worm, was born. And a little farther down, for fame had rumored that a fleet at sea would cause our nation's catastrophe, and hereupon it was my mother dear did bring forth twins at once, both me and fear. A poor worm, the twin of fear. Characteristically, Hobbes cuts individual human beings down to size, even himself. Born in Malmesbury, England, during the invasion of the Spanish Armada in 1588, war loomed large in Hobbes' life, especially civil war. In 1642, the year Hobbes published his first major work of political philosophy, De Cive, civil war erupted in England between monarchists and republicans. It would end 4 years later with the defeat of the monarchists, and 3 years after that, in 1649, with the execution of King Charles I and the subsequent rise of Oliver Cromwell. Hobbes would later write his own account of the Civil War in a text titled Behemoth. While you might think that Leviathan clearly evinces Hobbes' royalist sympathies, no one wanted to claim Hobbes in his own time. Republicans saw him as a monarchist who celebrated absolute power, monarchists as a subversive questioner who asserted the natural liberty of human beings to defend themselves, churchmen as a shocking atheist who debunked key theological doctrines such as the incorporeality of God. Hobbes was iconoclastic and original, yet he was also thinking through the changing political world around him. Just 3 years prior to the publication of Leviathan in 1651, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 had ended the 30 Years' War, and according to a standard, if questionable scholarly narrative, that peace had established in Europe a system of sovereign states, with each controlling its own territory and religious practices. In this context, Hobbes theorized the unlimited sovereign authority of the modern state. At the same time, Hobbes never wavered in identifying individual liberty or natural right as the source and limit on sovereignty, the premise of what we now know as the tradition of liberalism, small l, in political thought. Rich with paradoxes and deeply influential, Leviathan remains probably the greatest work of political theory written in English. What does the title of the work mean? Well, it's an allusion to the book of Job, where Leviathan appears as a terrifying sea creature. Here's a representative passage from Job 41, in Robert Alter's mesmerizing translation. Quote, "Missiles are deemed as straw, and he mocks the javelin's clatter. Beneath him jagged shards, he draws a harrow over the mud. He makes the deep boil like a pot, turns sea to an ointment pan. Behind him glistens a wake. He makes the deep seem hoary. He has no match on earth, made as he is without fear. All that is lofty he can see. He is king over all proud beasts. Invulnerable to human weapons, inspiring fear but fearless himself, the Leviathan crushes the proud. What is the significance of this allusion? Look at page 1 of our edition, the dedicatory letter addressed to Francis Godolphin. Hobbes praises Francis's late brother, Sidney, in whom Hobbes found every virtue, quote, shining in a generous constitution of his nature. Hobbes goes on to suggest that his political vision, he goes on to suggest this in the letter, does not depend on the rule of virtuous men like Sidney Godolphin. Instead, he theorizes what he calls the seat of power in the abstract. To explain what he means by the seat of power in the abstract, he refers to the story of the Capitoline geese, which, as you should remember from Livy, squawked as the Gauls attempted to scale the Capitol, alerting the Romans and saving the city. Whereas for Aristotle, as for Machiavelli, as for Livy, regimes survive and flourish when they are ruled by proud, virtuous men, Hobbes imagines a new political system that might be ruled by geese, that is, by ordinary men who need do no more than squawk when afraid. Hobbes' dedication of the book to Sidney Godolphin reads like an epitaph for a human type. The Hobbesian state does not need, and in fact crushes, the proud. Yet to make this claim, to have invented a political form that does not rely on human virtue for its functioning, betrays a certain kind of pride, no? In the passage from Job, God had adduced his creation of the Leviathan as proof of his omnipotence. God is the maker of the Leviathan. But who is the maker of the Hobbesian Leviathan? In the introduction, Hobbes makes clear that the answer is man. Human beings can vie with God. Look at the bottom of page 3, where Hobbes writes that the pacts and covenants by which the parts of this body politic were first made, set together, and united resemble that fiat, or let us make man, pronounced by God at the creation. One might even suppose that in certain respects, our creation is better than God's. As Hobbes writes on page 3, the Leviathan, that artificial man, is of greater stature and strength than the natural. What is more, in principle at least, the state is deathless. Nothing is certain except for death and taxes, that is, our death and the deathless state. The state outlasts us because it is artificial, perhaps the key point of the introduction. When I gave the Aristotle lecture in the fall, I compared Aristotle's politics to a medical school curriculum. If Aristotle writes for physicians of political life, I think we can say, on the basis of the introduction, that Hobbes writes for mechanics of political life. He will teach them how to take apart the state like a watch or a carburetor and then put it back together again. The artificiality of the state follows from the idea that human nature is in no way directed toward political life. Whereas Aristotle presents human beings as political animals, since political activity perfects our distinctively human capacities in his view, Hobbes says in De Quie that, quote, men emerge from the earth like mushrooms without any obligation to one another. Because by nature, individuals are isolated like mushrooms, in the dark under a log, their obedience to authority, their sociability requires artifice. It's constructed. Why does Hobbes think that human beings are like mushrooms, that is, individuals, rather than parts of natural communities like the family, village, or city in Aristotle's framework? Immediately in the introduction, page 3, we see that Hobbes is working with a new materialistic and scientific understanding of the human being. Quote, for seeing life is but a motion of the limbs, the beginning whereof is in some principal part within. Why may we not say that all automata, engines that move themselves by springs and wheels, as doth a watch, have an artificial life? For what is the heart but a spring? And the nerves, but so many strings, and the joints, but so many wheels, giving motion to the whole body, such as was intended by the artificer. Most importantly, Hobbes understands the human being as so much matter in motion. He utterly rejects Aristotle's teleological biology, according to which the human being has a natural telos, a determinate good. Hobbes allies himself instead with scientific thinkers of his day, such as William Harvey, who had discovered in 1628 that the heart functions as a pump to circulate blood throughout the body. In the first part of the work, then, titled Of Man, Hobbes develops this anti-teleological, materialistic view of the human being, especially of the human psyche. And he makes clear that he is employing a proto-scientific method by resolving the state into its smallest component part, the human being, and then constructing his political science on the foundation of this physical account of how that smallest part, the human being, moves, its behavior in the world. Let's say more then about Hobbes' reflections on method. Hobbes investigates political life as if it were so much human matter in motion, susceptible to the same methods employed by proto-Enlightenment scientists and mathematicians, of which he himself was one. He also knew others like Descartes and Francis Bacon and Galileo. This approach entailed the rejection of a kind of Christianized Aristotelianism known as scholasticism, the prevailing approach to the study of politics taught by all the universities of Europe at the time. Did you notice that Aristotle and the universities catch a lot of flack in Leviathan? At the conclusion of chapter 1, page 7, Hobbes rails against, quote, the philosophy schools through all the universities of Christendom grounded on certain texts of Aristotle. In particular, while Hobbes offers a materialist explanation of sense perception and all human experience, these churchmen, schoolmen, the university professors, because they wanted to maintain the incorporeality of the soul and of God, had offered ham-fisted accounts of human sight and understanding, invoking terms like a visible species or an intelligible species to explain the interaction of mind and world. This is just nonsense to Hobbes. In a brilliant and hilarious line, Hobbes calls these terms insignificant speech because they're literally insignificant. They don't refer to anything out there in the world. Remember this quip next time you're arguing with someone. Anyway, Hobbes reserves his most severe invective for philosophers, especially Aristotle. In chapter 5, on page 24, Hobbes throws down the gauntlet. Quote, there can be nothing so absurd but may be found in the books of philosophers. In chapter 46 of Leviathan, which we didn't have you read, titled Of Darkness from Vain Philosophy and Fabulous Traditions, page 457, Hobbes elaborates on this point from chapter 5. Quote, there is nothing so absurd that the old philosophers have not some of them maintained. And I believe that scarce anything can be more absurdly said in natural philosophy than that which now is called Aristotle's metaphysics, nor more repugnant to government than much of that he hath said in his politics, nor more ignorantly than a great part of his ethics. Yikes. What does Hobbes so disdain about Aristotle? Turn back to chapter 5, page 24, paragraph 7. Hobbes writes, the reason for the absurdity of philosophers is manifest, for there is not one of them that begins his ratiocination from the definitions or explications of the names they are to use, which is a method that hath been used only in geometry, whose conclusions have thereby been made indisputable. Aristotle lacked method. The prudent individual is Aristotle's standard. What it means to be courageous, who should rule in a given regime, these questions cannot be settled in the abstract for him. Instead, they require contextual judgment. Hobbes, by contrast, takes a very low view of prudence precisely because he wants to eliminate ambiguity and contestation from political life. Hobbes repeatedly says that prudence is but experience. Hobbes' standard is not prudence but mathematics, especially geometry, whose conclusions we've just heard are indisputable. In the prior chapter, chapter 4, page 19, section 12, again, not assigned, Hobbes had said that, quote, geometry is the only science that it hath pleased God hitherto to bestow on mankind. Indeed, who can argue about geometry, a constructed and closed system of reasoning that posits its own definitions and proceeds by established rules to conclusions that are demonstrably true within the system? Mathematics provides the model for political science. according to Hobbes. And yet one may wonder whether the stuff of politics can be understood and ordered with such precision. Remember, in fact, that while Hobbes claims to be methodical and scientific himself, he also says at the end of the introduction, page 2, that his account of human psychology can only be confirmed by the reader's own introspection. Quote, "The pains left another will be only to consider if he also find not the same in himself, for this kind of doctrine admitteth no other demonstration." One question is whether Hobbes is really so methodical and scientific as he claims, or whether he smuggles in certain moral and political views. How then does Hobbes understand human psychology? In short, he sees the psyche, he sees us as bundles of sensations and passions without a telos, without some sort of natural order to them. Gone is the hierarchically ordered soul of Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Instead, each of us is imprisoned by his or her own unreliable sense experiences, which, like the surrounding world, are just so much matter in motion. Again, Hobbes cuts human beings down to size. Some of this material is really funny, at least to me. Maybe I'm getting old. For example, when Hobbes explains on page 10 in chapter 2, again unassigned, how heat and cold in the body produce different kinds of dreams. In chapter 6, which you did read, Hobbes continues his debunking. Here, virtues are reduced to outbursts of passion. Courage, for example, on page 30, is merely fear of being hurt, accompanied by the hope that one can avoid harm through resistance. And a sudden impulse of this kind Hobbes calls anger. But if courage can no longer be distinguished from abject fear of bodily harm or reckless anger and violence, then this ethical virtue seems to have lost all meaning. On page 33, the intellectual faculties and virtues, such as deliberation and the will, receive similar treatment. Deliberation merely describes an alternation of appetites, and will is the last of these, the one that coincides with action. Can one distinguish good from bad decisions on this basis? Am I exercising deliberation and will when I eat an entire package of pull and peel Twizzlers at 2 a.m.? Yes, says Hobbes. Hobbes ties together many of these threads regarding human psychology at the beginning of chapter 11 of The Difference of Manners, page 57. Because there exists no human good, no summum bonum, and because human action and experience is driven by disorderly, disruptive passions, quote, "Felicity is a continual progress of the desire from one object to another, the attaining of the former being still but the way to the latter." On the next page, page 58, Hobbes concludes, "So that I put in the first place for a general inclination of all mankind a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth only in death. Whatever you want, you will need power to get it, and because as soon as you get it, you will want something else, you will remain anxious and crave power after power." Hobbes is arguably the first political thinker in the European tradition to offer a systematic analysis of the idea of power. The first line of chapter 10, page 50, lays out his systematic analysis of the idea of power. The first line of chapter 10, page 50, lays out his definition. Quote, "The power of a man, to take it universally, is his present means to obtain some future apparent good, and is either original or instrumental." Power refers to the natural or instrumental means we use to satisfy our desires. While Hobbes' analysis begins by ascribing power to strength and riches, it goes on to reveal the social dimension of power. In short, the appearance of power in society is power. Eloquence, form, honor, fear, and love, all these are kinds of power, according to Hobbes. Okay, Having taken apart the watch of the state and examined its smallest gears, namely us, Hobbes needs to put the watch back together to show us how human beings interface with one another. This he does in chapter 13, the famous chapter on the state of nature, and in the chapters that follow on the construction of the state, the commonwealth, the Leviathan. As an introduction to chapter 13, let me raise two related and lingering questions. Thus far, Hobbes has claimed to be a relativist on the question of the human good. But is he? Is there not a natural and defensible end of human desire, according to Hobbes? That's the first question. Second, if we all desire power after power, does that mean that Hobbes denies that some of us desire more power than others? What of the distinction Machiavelli drew, for example, between the people who want not to be oppressed and the great, the princes or would-be princes who want to dominate them, back in chapter 9 of The Prince? Keep these questions in mind. They will become important in this chapter. Chapter 13, of the natural condition of mankind as concerning their felicity and misery, page 74. It begins with the first argument for natural human equality that we have encountered in this course. In what respect, though, does Hobbes hold human beings to be equal by nature? Not in respect of their dignity. Hobbes writes, quote, "For as to the strength of body, the weakest has the strength to kill the strongest, either by secret machination or by confederacy with others that are in the same danger with himself. Each of us is strong enough to kill and vulnerable enough to be killed. And yet, how does this make us equal? Imagine the person you most admire. Do you consider yourself the natural equal of that person just because you could do away with him or her in theory? In any case, Hobbes proceeds. Our minds are even more equal than our bodies. How so? Page 75. Quote, "For such is the nature of men, that howsoever they may acknowledge many others to be more witty, or more eloquent, or more learned, yet they will hardly believe there be many so wise as themselves. But this proveth rather that men are in that point equal than unequal." That every human being suspects himself to be wise suggests that we're equal in a certain respect, namely equally vain. Human beings by nature acknowledge no superiors. This is a brilliant stroke. Hobbes says, in effect, to Plato and Aristotle, whatever the truth about our relative capacities for virtue or wisdom, it would be naive to order political life according to these putatively natural hierarchies, because in the event, such hierarchies will be disputed, flouted. No one will recognize them. In the seminar room, sure, someone may grant that he would be better ruled by the virtuous few or by a philosopher king, but he'll never in fact accept that this or that person is his natural ruler. Hobbes' next move is to deduce from what he calls our natural equality of ability a natural dynamic of competition and strife. In his own words, quote, "And therefore, if any two men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies, and in the way to their end, which is principally their own conservation, and sometimes their delectation, endeavor to destroy or subdue one another." This is a puzzling step in the argument for me. Why should these individuals fight rather than cooperate? If they really want only preservation and pleasure, as Hobbes says, then assuming they're not acting in a situation of extreme scarcity, and Hobbes hasn't said that they are, there might be opportunities for coordination. Why should they go so far as to destroy one another? The following paragraph, the fourth, at the bottom of page 75, sheds light on this puzzle. Here's the key line. Quote, "Also, because there be some that taking pleasure in contemplating their own power in the acts of conquest, which they pursue farther than their security requires, if others, that otherwise would be glad to be at ease within modest bounds, should not by invasion increase their power, they would not be able long time, by standing only on their defense, to subsist." So, Hobbes preserves the Machiavellian distinction between the people and the great, between those who want to be left alone and those who want to dominate after all. It's precisely because the latter exist in the state of nature that the best defense is a good offense. Here's an analogy. As usual, it involves my dog, Hank. When I walk Hank, who's a super friendly shepherd mix, he wants to say hi to other dogs. That's almost always fine. In rare cases, though, the other dog turns out to be aggressive. And aware of this possibility, I sometimes choose not to let Hank greet other dogs. The analogy isn't perfect. I promise we don't go on the attack ourselves. But the point is that aggressive pups, though they're few and far between, are out there and they change our behavior. Hank and I have to be at least somewhat on guard, even though almost every interaction is completely friendly. Okay, I think this reading is supported, if you follow it, I think this reading is supported by Hobbes' analysis of the three principal causes of quarrel in human nature on the following page, section 6 of the chapter. The three causes of quarrel: first, competition; second, diffidence, that is distrust or fear; and third, glory. In his analysis of the third cause, glory, Hobbes' tone almost drips with contempt. Those who pursue glory, those whom Hobbes had called vainglorious men in chapter 6, attack their fellows, quote, for trifles, as a word, a smile, a different opinion, and any other sign of undervalue, either direct in their persons or by reflection in their kindred, their friends, their nation, their profession, or their name. Isn't the problem, the reason that human beings are by nature at each other's throats, the presence of these vainglorious men who seek to dominate? To these three causes of quarrel in human nature, Hobbes eventually opposes, at the end of the chapter, page 78, three passions that incline men to peace, quote, fear of death, desire of such things as are necessary to commodious living, and a hope by their industry to obtain them. Two of these three causes of peace are suspiciously similar to two of the causes of quarrel. Doesn't the desire of commodious living remind us of competition over goods? Doesn't fear of death remind us of distrust among human beings equally capable of killing one another? One cause of quarrel, however, has dropped out, and that's glory. It has been replaced by the hope for the acquisition of commodious living through industry. Competition and distrust will remain, albeit in attenuated forms, in the Commonwealth. Fear and the desire for gain conduce to peace. But the Leviathan will crush the children of pride, the vainglorious men, the Machiavellian princes, or it will change their ambition into the bourgeois pursuit of status and wealth. Perhaps Hobbes does have a vision of the good after all. You remember I raised that question. I think it's bodily pleasure and peace. He is a kind of political Epicurean, even though that might sound like a kind of oxymoron, even as he inherits from Machiavelli a very hard-headed view of human psychology. Hobbes rejects altogether Machiavelli's love of glory and conquest. He's all about peace and pleasure. What then is the point of this vision of natural human conflict in chapter 13, aside from revealing ambitious, glory-seeking troublemakers to be the signal threat to peace? Note, first of all, what we mean when we talk about the state of nature. The state of nature refers to human interaction in the absence of a common power, outside politics. It is a heuristic, an inference from the passions, as Hobbes puts it, rather than an observable condition, though Hobbes certainly suggests that civil war and the anarchic condition of international affairs approximates the state of nature. More pointedly, why do we need to see, as Hobbes tells us in the work's most famous passages on page 76, that, quote, it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war as is of every man against every man. Why must we affirm that in the event of political collapse, there is no security, industry, culture, architecture, agriculture, education, historiography, art, society, and, quote, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short? Why? What's the point of all of this? The point is that even though we cannot agree on a summum bonum, a highest good, at least not openly, I've suggested Hobbes smuggles one in, we should all be able to agree on a summum malum, a worst evil. The state of nature obliterates every good thing in human life. Whatever you desire, you can't have it there. This negative orientation toward the state of nature replaces the positive promise of the classical city to cultivate human flourishing and excellence. The modern state simply aims to stave off political collapse caused by, say, factional strife or plague, and the fear of death that attends these extreme situations. That is its negative promise. Excuse me. How do we get out of the state of nature? What explains and justifies the movement from the state of nature to the commonwealth? Although Hobbes had said near the conclusion of chapter 13, page 77, that nothing can be unjust in the state of nature, he begins chapter 14, page 79, by proclaiming a right of nature. Quote, "The liberty each man hath to use his own power as he will himself for the preservation of his own nature, that is to say, of his own life." Hobbes' conception of natural right arises out of his picture of the individual human being as a creature of passion who wants to survive in the state of nature. And this right is a liberty in the materialist sense that by nature nothing stands in the way of human freedom. Nothing? As Hobbes had remarked in chapter 13, page 77, the desires and other passions of men are in themselves no sin. Human beings aren't fallen or evil creatures, they are simply creatures doing whatever they can to survive. We have a right to do what we cannot but do according to the necessity of our nature. By placing the right of the individual before his duties, the right before the good, the right before all political obligations, Hobbes inaugurates the liberal tradition of political thought. And while you may think of Hobbes as an absolutist, for good reason, as we're about to see, his liberal side really comes to the fore in chapter 14. For example, on page 87, sections 29 through 30, where Hobbes makes clear that one may resist imprisonment or execution, and one may not be made to accuse oneself, as in the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. Likewise, in chapter 21, section 17, page 143, Hobbes says that insurrectionists may resist the sovereign if they expect that once captured, they will face execution. Responding to this passage, an Anglican bishop, John Bramhall, wrote in an anti-Hobbesian polemic titled "The Catching of Leviathan," "Why should we not change the name of Leviathan into the Rebel's Catechism?" That's pretty amazing. Hobbes has such a liberal streak that at least one person read this book and thought that its name should be the Rebel's Catechism. Anyway, to get out of the state of nature, then, requires securing the right of nature. On the one hand, Hobbes outlines certain so-called laws of nature in chapters 14 and 15. Abiding by these laws will help human beings to live together peaceably. You might have expected Hobbesian laws of nature to describe the mechanical operation of human nature, but these laws read not like scientific, but like moral laws, evoking Thomistic natural law. Indeed, at first blush, Hobbesian natural law and Thomistic natural law may seem similar. Both Thomases suggest that the natural law can be identified with the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But look at Hobbes' first law of nature, to which the following 18 are really subordinate. They're sort of deductions from the first. The first reads that every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of obtaining it, and when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek and use all the helps of war. The first law of nature follows from the right of nature and is contingent on the satisfaction of that right. As a conditional rule rooted in our desire for mere survival, Hobbesian natural law in fact differs radically from Thomistic natural law, which consists in incontrovertible first principles of practical reason, and which Aquinas also calls simply conscience, our capacity to choose between good and evil. In any case, the laws of nature will not work by themselves to make human beings peaceable, not even close. Why not? Turn to chapter 17, the first chapter of the second part, page 106. Quote, "For the laws of nature, as justice, equity, modesty, mercy, and in some doing to others as we would be done to, of themselves, without the terror of some power to cause them to be observed, are contrary to our natural passions that carry us to partiality, pride, revenge, and the like." Section 13 of chapter 13, the big paragraph on page 109, provides the Hobbesian solution: the construction of a common power authorized by mutual covenant among the people to rule on their behalf as their representative for the sake of the peace and safety of all. Notice what Hobbes isn't saying here. He isn't saying that the people make a covenant with a particular person or assembly to rule them. Rather, the people covenant among themselves, transferring their natural right to defend themselves to a sovereign representative, an executive, who will ensure their peace and safety and enforce contracts among them. Again, look at the middle of page 109. Hobbes writes, "It is as if every man should say to every man, I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man or to this assembly of men, on this condition that thou give up thy right to him and authorize all his actions in like manner." As Hobbes had argued in the prior chapter, chapter 16, the state therefore depends on a legal fiction. The artificial person of the sovereign representative personates or acts as the agent of the people who, according to this legal fiction, authorize the sovereign's rule. Also on this point, you might think back to the dedicatory letter. Hobbes is not even recommending a particular kind of commonwealth, though he clearly prefers monarchy, or rather, he's not recommending a particular form of government, though he clearly prefers monarchy, so much as he is defending sovereignty itself, the seat of power in the abstract, which could be occupied by fearful geese, as we said, at least in the limit case of the very well-designed state. Who the sovereign power is, then, does not very much matter. At the same time, because the people covenant among themselves to transfer their right to all things to the sovereign who will ensure it on their behalf, they can make no claims against the sovereign so long as their preservation is secure. Hobbesian sovereignty is absolute and unlimited because, in Hobbes' view, the power to protect is inescapably the power to oppress. As Hobbes argues in chapter 18, section 6, page 112, it would be absurd for subjects to accuse the sovereign of injustice, as they themselves are the authors of the sovereign power, and so of the injustice they allege. I've already used one bad analogy in this lecture, so let me try another. Imagine a classic town of the American West in the 19th century. In many such towns, you couldn't in fact walk the streets armed, although we often have that, that sort of caricature, that picture of cowboys. You couldn't walk the streets of the town armed. Instead, upon entering town, you had to give up your gun to the sheriff or to the saloon keeper. No shootouts. This was good for everyone. But what prevented the guy keeping the guns from robbing everyone blind, or worse? Hobbes would say, you'll have to live with that problem, or you can return to everyone their guns and see what happens. Here, then, is the illiberal, absolutist side of Hobbes, which also finds expression in chapter 21, page 140, where Hobbes rants about, quote, the specious name of liberty, by which he means the free way of life, the life of citizenship, championed by Republican thinkers from Aristotle to Cicero to the civic Republicans of Hobbes' own day. Similarly, in chapter 30, on the offices of the sovereign representative, Hobbes writes on page 223, section 9, that subjects, quote, ought to be informed how great a fault it is to speak evil of the sovereign representative, whether one man or an assembly of men, or to argue and dispute his power, or any way to use his name irreverently. The Leviathan prohibits freedom of speech, too. Unlike the next thinker on our syllabus, John Locke, not to mention contemporary liberal thinkers, Hobbes outlines no limits on the authority of the state, nor does he specify an array of rights that individuals can assert against state power. We're left then with many questions about this paradoxical theorist of liberal absolutism. Consider the following questions by way of conclusion. How can Hobbes defend sovereignty or the seat of power in the abstract? Is that to say that Hobbes would defend equally and with the same arguments the sovereign power of the United States and Iran, Canada and North Korea, Russia and Saudi Arabia? Somehow a sovereign state is a sovereign state is a sovereign state? One may wonder, moreover, whether the subjects of the Leviathan have really escaped the existential dread of the state of nature. If fear is the passion to be reckoned on by the sovereign, as Hobbes puts it near the end of chapter 14, then doesn't fear remain fear of the state itself? In addition, if representative government can somehow combine and personate the wills of all the people who comprise the Commonwealth, then one might wonder whether representative government could yield new forms of citizenship and political community without sacrificing the Hobbesian ends of peace and comfort. Finally, and most fundamentally, why should we take peace, comfort, and bodily pleasure to be the highest goods? I hope that you'll have a chance to address these questions and many others in your sections. Thanks so much for listening.